Well, I guess we can get started. First of all, welcome everybody. It is great having you here. We really appreciate you all coming. Your participation is critical, and we have a lot to talk about, so it's really, really wonderful to see everybody come together. Before we do anything else, just want to acknowledge people that really did the hard work to bring this together. So that's Nicole Dunham right there, and Kim Weinstein. Thank you both very much. And Bob Holt. So let me just give you a little background. Why did we organize this conference? When I say we, I mean me and Patrick, along with Nicole, Kim. So the idea for the conference, I like to say it was my idea. Great. I can take absolutely zero credit. The idea for the conference was Patrick. So those of you who may not know Patrick was a professor at Florida State. So we managed to recruit him up here to UMass. We said we have this incredible program, economics program, Political Economy Research Institute, and we'd really like you to join us. And Winnie over there, his wonderful wife, somehow invited them. And when he got here, Jerry Epstein, co-director of PERI, and I did ask Patrick, now that PERI, what would you like to do? What was the first thing you'd like to do? Can't hear? Okay. What would you like to do now that you're here? We got you here, now what would you like to do? And he said, well, the first thing I want to do is organize a conference, exactly the conference that we have. And the real kernel of the idea was the incredible work that has been done by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, with which Patrick has, I'm not clear exactly what your association, but he said that's where I want to start in organizing a conference that brings together organizers, important organizers, activists, researchers, a few professors here and there. And we want to start from the model of the successful, important breakthrough achievements of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, and build from that and build connections and broaden it both within our own region here, and we have incredible speakers from our region, New England, nationally and internationally. Lucky to have so many of you come. So that's really how the project started. And we see this as a first step, in a sense. In another sense, it's not a first step, so if I may, tout a little bit what we've done at PERI. Patrick has given us a lot of new ideas and inspiration. On the other hand, we've kind of been doing a lot of this for, let's say, 25 years. So, PERI has been active in a lot of work around building worker power and supporting it. For example, work on living wage movement, anti-sweatshop movement, single-payer health care, and just transition around building a green economy, similar kinds of things. And so the idea that Patrick had of connecting with the work around farm workers, starting with Immokalee workers, obviously meshes perfectly with the work that we've been doing here for a long time at PERI. So it is really a great opportunity, and again, we see this as really a first step in advancing beyond what we've been doing for the last 25 years, strengthening these relationships, really critical for supporting well-being and power for low-wage workers, both U.S. and international. So that's kind of the basics. what we have a fantastic program of speakers, and then what we will do at the end on Saturday, last session, is kind of brainstorm and see where we can take this beyond the conference. Because, yes, there's a lot of conferences, but we want to not just be a conference. We want to see community and nation advance forward. And that's one of the reasons, maybe not the only reason, one of the reasons why we have the incredible equipment back there that Nicole has arranged to really keep an excellent record of this event and to see where we can build off of it. And maybe a moment to say welcome to all the people who are watching online. And hopefully you are getting a very high experience since we went all the make a high quality experience. So that's my introduction, and I'm going to now ask Patrick, the brains behind the operation, to give his brief comments, and then I will then introduce our
Thanks to that great introduction by Bob, my comments will be quite short. I want to say thank you to all of you for coming. Hope you got here without much problem. Oh, you can't hear? Okay. Better. All right. Again, thank you for all of you for coming. I am very, very, very happy to see all of you. This is a very diverse group of people, right? With academics and people who are actually involved in raising the wages and improving the working conditions of low-paid workers. And I think this is a fantastic group, and over the next couple of days, we should really learn a lot from everyone involved. And I guess I will also have to give a big thanks to my colleague here, Bob Poland. You know, I think I started discussions with Greg and Laura maybe last December or something, and then I pitched the idea to Bob in January, and then we started working on the schedule and program, trying to decide, well, who to invite, how should this thing look, and we got to that point, and then I kind of abandoned Bob. It's like, he got it. I found out, okay, I'm going to be incoming chair, and then Laura actually became the chair, and then, so now I spend lots of time doing chair stuff, but glad Bob kept it going. And so we have the program we have this evening. And again, thank you for all coming.
All right, thank you, Patrick. So, this is our first session. Really honored to have as our plenary speaker Lupe Gonzalo, and her remarks are going to be translated by Marley Monacello, both from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. And I just want to give you a little background on Lupe. You can read about her. She was featured recently on a Rebels Girl podcast, and really, really fascinating. And so I'm just going to read to you a little bit from the summary of this and some of the excerpts to give you a sense of who we have, who we're really quite honored to have as our plenary speaker. Whoops, get it back up. Okay. Better? Okay. Raised in a rural village in Guatemala, Lupe journeyed to the United States in hope of finding a better life, but was instead met with the kind of horrific exploitation that remains all too common in agricultural and low-wage work beyond the protections of a fair food program that she will explain to you. Once she found out about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which she did during a visit by the CIW's worker-to-worker education team to the farm where she was picking tomatoes in the early days of the Fair Food program, she immediately saw an opportunity to right the historic wrongs that plagued U.S. fields and has never looked back since. Now let me just read to you from the actual podcast, which describes Lupe's work follows. Lupe continues her mission of standing up for farm workers' rights to this day. She remembers what it was like to barely have enough to survive, to trek through the mountains to get to go to school, and to be scared of harassment at work. She is proud to dedicate her life to teaching, not in a classroom, but in the field. She teaches farm workers how to fight for their rights. She teaches people who've never worked in the fields to respect where each piece of food originates. It is so easy to bite into an apple or drink a glass of milk without ever thinking about where it came from, how it got to your table. But Lupe urges us to really think about it. And this is a quote. Quote from Lupe. Food doesn't come to the grocery store by magic. It comes from people. It comes from farm work. So again, we are really honored to have Lupe to make the first Lupe Gonzalo.
Hola, buenas tardes. Gracias por el espacio, por la oportunidad de compartir el trabajo.
So hello. Thank you so much for having us here and for the opportunity to share a little bit more about our work.
Y pues como hablo un poco en este podcast, ¿verdad? Soy una trabajadora del campo. Por muchos años enfrenté diferentes tipos de abusos en mi experiencia trabajando más de 10 años. La situación para nosotros como trabajadores es muy difícil.
So as I spoke about in the podcast, I worked for many years in the fields, experiencing myself some of the abuses in the field. So I worked there for over 10 years.
Entonces, para hablar un poquito más sobre quiénes somos una organización que lucha por los derechos humanos y estamos basados en Immokalee, Florida.
And first, to give you a little bit of a background, we at the Coalition are a human rights organization, and we are based in Immokalee, Florida.
Y es una comunidad mayormente de trabajadores agrícolas migrantes que venimos de diferentes países y cosechamos los tomates y los vegetales que se consumen diariamente.
We are a largely immigrant community, and we harvest many of the fruits and vegetables that are enjoyed today in the country.
Y pues cuando yo comencé a trabajar hace más que 20 años, la situación pues especialmente para nosotras como mujeres enfrentando acoso sexual era una experiencia bastante grave.
And when I began working in the fields over 20 years ago now, the experiences that we had as workers, and especially as women in the fields, was incredibly serious.
El acoso sexual para nosotras como mujeres se había convertido en el pan de cada día. Era muy común que uno enfrentaba acoso sexual como comentarios, bromas o hasta contacto físico y no había ninguna consecuencia para que nosotras fuéramos respetadas.
Especially there was the issue of sexual harassment, which really felt like the daily bread of farm worker women. Whenever you were in the fields, it was common for you to experience vulgar comments, comments that were made to you, and up to physical contact as well. That was very common for all of us.
Y muchas veces cuando uno intentaba reportar el abuso, habían amenaza por parte de los patrones o por parte de los supervisores, que si uno reportaba, pues iba a ser despedido del lugar del trabajo.
And there were never any consequences for that behavior. There was never anything that would happen to people when they would do that kind of thing. And when you were at work, if you did report or thought about reporting, you knew that at the end of the day, ultimately you were the one who was going to be fired.
Y pues nosotros no teníamos opción, ¿verdad? Porque el trabajo que nosotros hacemos, el dinero que nosotros ganamos, nos sirve para mantener a la familia. Si nosotros perdemos el trabajo, eso quiere decir que no vamos a tener comida en nuestras mesas.
And as workers, we really felt that we had no option because the money that we were making was essential for maintaining our families, and losing your job was simply not an option because that meant that we would not have money to put food on the table for our family.
Entonces, uno tenía que pensarlo muy bien, si reportar el abuso o quedar sin comida por semanas.
And so you basically had to look at it that way. If I report this abuse, then I'm going to end up without food on the table, possibly for weeks on end.
Y eso era la situación que enfrentaban la mayoría de mujeres que estábamos trabajando en las labores. Otro de los abusos que uno veía es el robo de salario. Muchas veces a nosotros como trabajadores no se nos pagaba el sueldo completo por el trabajo que hacíamos por más de 10 horas.
So that was an incredibly common experience for us as female workers. Another that we experienced very often was wage theft. So frequently we would not even be paid for the amount of work that we were doing in the fields.
Y casos bien extremos que se vio en la industria son los casos de esclavitud moderna, donde trabajadores estaban privados de su libertad, trabajadores que estaban encerrados bajo llave, incluso trabajadores que fueron encadenados para que no escaparan.
And in extreme cases in agriculture, there are also cases of forced labor in which workers are deprived of their freedom. They are kept under threat of violence and even locked up at night to keep them in one place.
Entonces, viendo todas estas situaciones fue como nace la coalición, fue empezar a organizar y a concientizar a los trabajadores del campo cómo podíamos ver un cambio en el futuro, que estos problemas que nosotros enfrentábamos se pudiera prevenir.
And it was from that landscape that the coalition of Immokalee workers emerged in order to try to get together and to seek a solution that would actually bring real and lasting change to these abuses that we were facing.
Entonces, los trabajadores empezaron a juntar para analizar estos problemas. Durante ese tiempo de que los trabajadores se juntaban, hubieron varias acciones que pasaron en la comunidad, acciones como paros laborales, marcha contra la violencia y una huelga de hambre que duró 30 días por parte de 6 trabajadores.
And so workers began to come together to raise consciousness, to analyze their situation, to mobilize. And in those early days, the CIW put on a number of actions in the community, major strikes in the community, march against violence, and even a hunger strike that lasted for 30 days.
Y estas acciones los trabajadores estaban haciendo con la idea de llegar a un diálogo con los rancheros, cómo podían tener esta conversación para que ellos pudieran ayudar a que estos abusos no siguieran pasando en los ranchos.
And our goal in those days was to bring the growers to the table, the employers to the table, because we thought with them at the table in dialogue, we could try to find a solution to these abuses we were facing.
Pero lastimosamente pues nunca llegaron a un acuerdo los rancheros. Ellos siempre tenían excusas, siempre estaban evadiendo pues el hecho de querer hablar con los trabajadores. Entonces pues los trabajadores sabían que si no iban a llegar a un acuerdo con los rancheros para eliminar estos abusos, se tenían que buscar otras estrategias.
And yet, with all of that work behind us, we still were never able to bring the growers to the table to come into a real agreement with us about seeking that solution. And so, after many of those actions, we saw that ultimately we were going to need a new strategy.
En el año 2000, la coalición, los trabajadores empezaron a analizar, ¿verdad?, cómo poder llegar al poder más grande arriba de los rancheros, cómo se podía traer ese poder para proteger los derechos de los trabajadores.
And so around 2000, 2001, the CIW and workers in Immokalee began to get together to ask that question, where is the power and how do we bring that power that is above the growers themselves, how do we bring that to bear in order to enforce our rights?
Entonces se empezó a ver que las corporaciones, ¿verdad?, tienen ese poder grande. Entonces se empezó a ir directamente a presionar a las grandes corporaciones para que ellos firmaran acuerdos legales con los trabajadores y así poder hacer un cambio.
And so we identified that power in the large buyers at the top of the supply chain and thought if we could get them to the table, then we could bring change into the fields. And so we launched a campaign in order to win legally binding agreements with those buyers at the top in order to find change.
pero también empezamos a concientizar a los consumidores, porque pues como consumidores muchas veces ni sabemos de dónde vienen los productos que comemos cada día, ni sabemos las condiciones que los trabajadores enfrentan para llevar esa comida hasta su mesa.
And all of that had to begin with raising consciousness among consumers to help consumers understand, because many consumers and all of us, we don't always ask where our food comes from, much less what the conditions are that exist behind the food that's on our tables.
Entonces, después de muchos años de hacer marchas, de hacer protestas, tuvimos una victoria bastante importante con Taco Bell.
And so after many years of marches and types of actions, we had an incredibly important initial victory with Taco Bell.
Y la campaña se empezó en el 2001, en donde empezamos pues ver que estas corporaciones pues podían llegar a estos acuerdos. Cuando trajimos a Taco Bell, vimos que era una victoria, pero también se necesitaba que más corporaciones se pudieran unir a estos acuerdos para llegar a verdaderamente proteger los derechos de los trabajadores.
So after that, the spark of that idea began in 2001 of thinking this is where, starting this campaign and saying we can win these agreements and win power from these corporations. And then we arrived to that first agreement with Taco Bell a number of years later. We realized that was still wasn't enough. We were going to need more of that power and more of those agreements.
Y hasta ahorita, desde que empezamos la campaña, tenemos a 14 corporaciones que han firmado acuerdos con los trabajadores. En este tiempo que hemos llevado, pues muchos consumidores, mucha gente se ha unido para apoyar la lucha de los trabajadores.
And to make a very long story short, we now have agreements with 14 major companies today since we launched the campaign. And that is, again, by bringing many, countless consumers on board to support our campaigns.
Y en estas acciones todavía pues yo trabajaba en las labores, pero también iba a diferentes acciones que la coalición organizaba. Yo dejaba de trabajar para ir a las protestas, para ir a las marchas junto con mis hijos, para traer más corporaciones y traer protecciones.
And before the program, and when I was still working in the fields, I participated in a lot of those actions as a worker. I would leave work behind for a week at a time to go to marches, to go to actions in order to bring those corporations to the table.
Entonces, ya que tenemos el poder de mercado, ya que tenemos las corporaciones, en el 2011 se empezó a implementar lo que es el programa de comida justa.
And thanks to many of those actions that we did in winning that power, in 2011, we were able to launch the Fair Food Program.
Los rancheros llegaron también a acuerdo con los trabajadores, ya que teníamos al mercado, pues también los rancheros tenían que entrar porque las corporaciones solamente iban a comprar sus tomates en estos ranchos que estaban implementando el código de conducta.
And so finally, we had the growers at the table because the growers knew from those agreements that we had with major buyers that they were now only going to be able to sell their products if they started implementing the Fair Food Program and the rights that we wanted.
Entonces, con el programa de comida justa se hacen sesiones de educación de trabajador a trabajador.
And so within the Fair Food Program, we do worker-to-worker education sessions.
En este tiempo, cuando empezó el programa de comida justa, también yo seguía trabajando en las labores. Recuerdo que llegaron algunos compañeros de la coalición, que ahora son mis compañeros, a hacer sesiones de educación, a hablar con nosotros los trabajadores de cuáles eran las nuevas reglas que se iban a estar implementando en los ranchos donde estábamos trabajando.
And in those early days of the Fair Food Program, I was still working in the fields, in the tomato fields. And I remember when a number of people from the coalition, who today are my colleagues, came to the fields to do that worker-to-worker education session and started explaining to me the new rules and regulations and standards that were going to be put into place on the farm.
Para nosotros los trabajadores eso fue un cambio bastante grande, porque por primera vez en más de una década trabajando sin protecciones, ahora nosotros los trabajadores teníamos una voz para reportar los abusos y que nosotros no íbamos a sufrir las consecuencias, sino de quienes no estaban aceptando este nuevo programa.
And so it was the first time after 10 years for me of working in the fields that we as workers felt that we actually had a voice in the fields, that we were able to report problems and abuses that were happening, and that we weren't going to be fired. We weren't going to face consequences from these growers who essentially, if they wanted to sell their product, had to do this program.
Especialmente pues sobre el acoso sexual. De haber enfrentado situaciones difíciles de abuso, ahora las mujeres podíamos regresar a nuestra casa, sentar con nuestros hijos, tener una cena bien, porque no estábamos pensando en ese problema, en ese abuso que nos estaba afectando cada día.
And thinking again about the theme of sexual harassment, for the first time in having that prevented on the farm, especially as women, we were able to go home and sit with our children and sit with our family without carrying the weight of that fear and that abuse home from work every day.
Entonces, por eso el hacer sesiones de educación es bastante importante, porque en esas sesiones están presentes los contratistas, los supervisores, y queda claro que acoso sexual es cero tolerancia.
And so today, again, those education sessions are critical, because here we are as workers talking about these rights, and not only are workers present, but supervisors are present. And everyone is sitting there hearing the same message, which is that sexual assault and violence is a zero tolerance offense.
También los trabajadores recibimos lo que es el bono por comida justa, que es pagado por las corporaciones. Ellos pagan 1 centavo más por cada libra de tomate que compran, y ese dinero va dirigido directamente a los trabajadores en forma de bono.
We also receive the Fair Food Program Premium, which is a bonus that's paid also by those large corporations at the top, and that gets transferred to workers in the form of a bonus in their paychecks.
También se creó el Consejo por Comida Justa, que es una organización independiente, y vamos a escuchar más de ellos y explicar ellos su trabajo más a fondo el día de mañana.
We also created the Fair Food Standards Council, a third-party body to monitor those rights. You'll be hearing a lot more about their work on a panel tomorrow.
Entonces, pues el programa se empezó a implementar en la Florida, pero ha estado expandiendo a otros lugares, a otros productos. Entonces, más trabajadores están ahora recibiendo este programa, estos derechos, y se ha logrado prevenir que abusos como el acoso sexual, el robo de salario o esclavitud moderna pasen en estos ranchos.
And although we began in Florida, the Fair Food Program is growing swiftly. We're now in many different states, a number of different products, and with every one of those advances, more and more workers are receiving those protections and are working in a place in which those abuses like wage theft and sexual harassment and forced labor are prevented altogether.
Y más recientemente, pues lanzamos un programa piloto en países de Chile, en Sudáfrica, en las Floridas.
And most excitingly, in the last year, we launched our first pilot programs internationally for the Fair Food Program in the flour industry in Chile and South Africa.
Y aparte de eso, también el modelo del programa es algo que se sigue expandiendo. A través de la red de WSR, otros trabajadores, otros grupos tienen la oportunidad de usar el modelo o elementos del modelo para protecciones en su lugar de trabajo.
And more broadly than that, the model of worker-driven social responsibility established by the FFP is expanding. So through the network, the the WSR network, and through the different elements of that model, we've been able to see replication in many other industries as well.
Entonces, desde que se empezó a implementar el programa, hemos tenido la oportunidad de recibir a grupos de trabajadores en Immokalee, en nuestra oficina, para tener conversaciones con ellos de cómo se vería el modelo en su industria.
And so, since the early days of the program, we have welcomed many different groups of workers to Immokalee to observe and see for themselves the Fair Food Program and how it works.
Han venido trabajadores de Justicia Migrante, que está en Vermont, aquí muy cerca, a Immokalee. También han venido delegaciones de Lesotho, de trabajadores en la construcción, con la cual pues han ido a los ranchos para ver cómo es el programa, a las sesiones de educación.
We've had the opportunity to host, whether it's workers from Milk with Dignity, from Migrant Justice in Vermont, not too far from here, who have come to Florida, international delegations from, for example, from the country of Lesotho, and also construction workers, most recently from the Twin Cities, who have come to Immokalee to observe the education sessions and look at how the program works and how it could be applied in their industries.
Entonces hemos tenido esa oportunidad de ayudar a ellos también con algunas estrategias, y eso pues a nosotros nos da la esperanza de que cambios sí pueden existir, mientras el trabajador o los trabajadores sean los que están liderando el programa de WSR, porque ese es un elemento esencial entre este programa.
And every one of those visits is a source of hope for us, and proof that this model, as it is being implemented, driven, and built by workers themselves in all of those industries, can create real change for many more people.
Entonces, aparte de lo que ya mencionamos, nosotros seguimos nuestro trabajo, porque fuera de las protecciones del programa de comida justa, todavía hay millones de trabajadores en la industria agrícola, en la construcción, en la pollería, que enfrentan situaciones de abuso, y por eso queremos que más corporaciones pueden unirse a nuestro programa y poder expandirlo.
Because that worker-driven element is essential to this model. And that's why, and we see that there are so many more workers because our work has not ended here. There are so many more people in industries, in the agricultural industry, in the textile industry, in the poultry industry, who are still suffering these abuses. And our hope is to continue to expand.
Todavía tenemos campañas con corporaciones. Ahorita tenemos campaña con Kroger, tenemos también con Wendy's. Y la razón por qué seguimos eso es porque hemos visto casos recientes de esclavitud moderna que están saliendo dentro de la industria agrícola, y las corporaciones no están haciendo nada para asegurar que en su cadena de surtidores no exista estos problemas de abuso.
And we continue our work on the campaign as well. We have ongoing campaigns with large companies like Wendy's and Kroger. There are still companies that are refusing to join the Fair Food Program, and we continue that work in particular with urgency because even as of recently, there was a forced labor case in Florida that came out that was found to be in the supply chain of one of these companies.
Entonces, es parte de lo que es el trabajo. Sé que es muy resumido todo, pero esto es para compartir, y vamos a tener un espacio para preguntas que ustedes tengan, y pues gracias nuevamente por este espacio.
So thank you all. That is, of course, a very condensed summary of a great deal of work that the CIW has done. But again, thank you all so much for having us here, and there will, of course, be opportunity for questions.
Our next speaker is somebody we already talked about. So Patrick Mason. After Patrick's presentation, then we will have a time for discussion, question, and answer. So, Professor Patrick Mason.
That was fantastic. I can never hear enough about the victories of the Coalition of Immokalee workers. So my comments in some ways are a prequel to Coalition of Immokalee workers and how things were before the victories of that organization. That was my thank you. Okay. So in a way, this conference for me kind of represents not only an academic issue, but really kind of full circle in my own personal story. I'll say a little bit more about this in a second, but I started out in this little town called Sebring, Florida, which is known for nothing. The county is like a giant orange grove with some towns in the middle of it. And I spent a lot of time in those orange groves, and the things learned from picking oranges and later cucumbers and watermelons and tomatoes kind of led to my interest in economics. And in 2007, I was actually at a conference on social, the conference was Realizing Economic and Social Rights in Cuernavaca, Mexico. I did not expect to hear anything about Immokalee in Cuernavaca. But I ran into Kathy Albisa, who was the National Economics and Social Rights Initiative, and she was fascinated to have a conversation with an economist who said that she actually understood. And she began to tell me about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and also what then NESRI, National Economics and Social Rights Initiative, but they've since changed their name to Partners for Dignity, right? But she began to tell me about the coalition and the penny per pound program, which I thought was just innovative and one of the just magnificent. And interest in that program and my academic work, sort of, they all come together, right? Because even as a child, this constant thing on my mind was like, how do you go about improving the standard of living and the well-being of low-wage workers? In my community in Sebring, just about everybody was an orange picker. A lot of the women were domestics and housekeeping, but some of them were out in the fields, and just about all of the men were in the fields. So it wasn't just like one or two families. It was the entire neighborhood. And we were all, like, my grandfather was first moved to Sebring, so he was like one generation out of slavery. And the pickers in the orange fields were the children and the grandchildren of the people who had been enslaved. Right? So it was very, very similar. Anyway, that's Sebring. It started the blue dot there. That's the part of Florida that nobody knows exists. That's not in the commercials, where you see the beaches and people have. No, that's not Sebring. All right. Sebring is like in the middle of the peninsula. And then that first town there, Laybell as we call it, pick watermelons, cucumbers, and tomatoes there. And then we go down to Immokalee, pick the same thing. So Sebring, Laybell and Immokalee is down on the up, and Sebring is back oranges and lots of citrus and cows. But we spend time, sometimes we go down there, and that was a long ride. So when it's time to pick tomatoes, you get up about 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, drive for an hour, and you'd be in the field down there. Now, I started doing this when I was very young, right? 1961, 62, somewhere around. I was about 3 or 4 years old. And, yeah, I did this until 1979. So it was like second nature. And oranges, like October to May. So right around now, there's time for oranges. Mostly male workers, but not exclusive. And at this time, the population was domestic, native-born African-American workers, and English-speaking Caribbean immigrants, right? Trinidad, Jamaica. And that was true probably until about 74, 75. Now, what happened in 74, 75? There was an international recession, very deep recession. It was bad in the U.S., it was worse in Mexico. So at that point, large numbers of Mexican workers began coming into that part of Florida for the first time. The workers in Sebring, as I said, these were also migrants, but they were domestic migrants. The people in that part of Florida, slavery was in northern Florida, in Leon County, where I live now, Tallahassee. And the county's named after presidents and Ponce de Leon. So in Madison County, Jefferson County, great names in American history, those were slave counties. Gadsden, slave county, right? So the people would migrate from that part of Florida down to South Florida, and that was the agricultural labor crew. And also people from Alabama, Georgia, Carolinas. Florida's always been different, right? This is the only state in the South where people moved south, where they migrated to the South. Everybody else was leaving South, except for in Florida, people moved to South Florida, from other southern places. And the Caribbean workers were also the cane cutters. And You know, many of these people coming from Jamaica, Trinidad, elsewhere were also undocumented. And it's been starting in 1974, present, get lots of Mexican workers. Starting in the 80s, lots of workers from Central America. So, with all of the Reagan activity in Central America, lots of workers came to Florida, and a lot of them ended up down in Central Florida and South Central Florida. Oh, okay. All right. Oh, yeah. So the watermelons, cucumbers, tomatoes, right? That's what we did in Laybell and Immokalee, except different time of year, right? So we would do that like between February and June, and there were more women involved in those activities than oranges. And the watermelons, the same thing in spring. Watermelons were huge, right? They're smaller now. Right, but this is incredibly difficult work. You know, there's picnic-sized Jubilee watermelons that you have to pick, right? And so that was further away from Sebring, down in those communities, Laybell and Immokalee, right? And not only that, but then after the watermelons, the cucumbers, and tomatoes ran out, then people from my hometown, including me, would migrate up to South Carolina. Johnston, South Carolina is famous for, I think, two things. They grow lots of peaches in Johnston. They're very good. And it's right across from, James Brown hometown. And that's it for Johnston. And this other little town, Inman, is right out of a city called Spartanburg. They grow lots of peaches in Inman. Right, so South Carolina has a lot of peaches, and so people would work there in Johnston and Inman, and around this time they start returning to Sebring to begin the whole cycle all over again, which, as you can imagine, has a big impact on the education of children, because the children leave school around April or May before the year's over, and then they're coming back well, maybe they're coming back now. I mean, DeSantis kind of messed things up. But they would be coming back around October or November after school has started, right? So I learned a lot of things from being out there in the field, surprisingly, so kind of a natural attraction to economics. One is textbooks have a lot about labor markets that are just wrong, and they're nonsensical. It's not individual workers negotiating contracts or pay with individual entrepreneurs. No, that's not quite how things work. It's workers as a class allied against large multinational conglomerates that have state power, and where the workers are usually from some subaltern group or pariah group, right? They're African Americans, Mexicans, quote unquote, illegal aliens. That's different from who actually owns the groves, who owns the fields, right? So that, for example, during all the years that I worked in Orange Grove, from like early 60s to the late 70s, there was exactly one white orange picker that I encountered. And that was like post 74, 75. That guy was from Canada. I don't know what he was doing in Florida. I think he was just lost. And it's exploited, right? It's extremely exploited, and the exploitation reproduces the racial and class inequality. We tried to organize, but it's very difficult. In the 60s, after the victories of the United Farm Workers in California, there was hope that we could do the same thing in Florida, but it never happened. Right? So I decided to look up the pay, because I'm a labor economist. Right? So boxes is the measure of the for oranges. You fill them up in boxes, and if you are a really the average worker will will pick about 60 boxes a day. That's the average. A box, I think, is like a bushel and a third. And at that time, in the early 70s, the pay was about 25 cents a box, excuse me. So it's piece rate work. And if you figure 8 hours to pick 60 boxes, that works down to $1.88 an hour. The federal minimum wage in 1974 was $2 an hour. So it's like, well, how can that be? How can the wage be less than the federal minimum? Because agricultural workers aren't protected by the labor laws, right? So you end up with a minimum wage that, for the average worker is less than minimum. An exceptional orange picker could pick 100 boxes a day. You have to be very strong, very fast. I never did 100. I could do about 80 or 90. But even with that, that only comes to about $3.13 an hour, right? And by the mid to late 70s, the prices had gone up to about 35 cents a box. So, yeah, if you were exceptional, you could probably earn above minimum wage. But even those wage numbers don't quite tell the whole story because there are no benefits, like none. There's no sick leave, no vacation day, no pension, no medical, no dental, no paid time off, nothing. I went to my first dentist when I was 21 and a graduate student at the University of Michigan. Right? People in my neighborhood just didn't go to the dentist because they didn't have dental insurance. It's piece rate, so no work, no pay. Right? Which means that all the risk are on the workers. So if it rains and you can't work, no pay. If it's too cold, and we're talking Floridians here, so it didn't take much to be too cold. It's like no pay. If it's excessive heat, which could be a big problem, and you couldn't work, it's just too hot, no pay. So a lot of times in the morning when you got to pick oranges, the trees are soaked with water. And if you pick oranges in those trees, you will get wet and possibly very sick. My neighbor, a guy 2 houses down from us, did this. He got very sick and he died. All right, so it's not a good thing to do. There were no toilets, all right, anywhere. No place to wash your hands, no place to store your food. So you brought your own food and you kind of stored it as best you could. And it wasn't unusual for the trees to be sprayed with pesticide before picking them. I don't know why they did this. But, of course, since you have to pick the fruit to make money, it didn't matter that they've been sprayed with it. You just pick the fruit with the pesticide on it. There was no union, no way of getting good pay. So sometimes there was extra pay for what we call bad fruit. There wasn't enough oranges per tree. But the workers would have to band together for this. And sometimes there were people who had to be convinced that it was a good thing to join together. There's no such thing as child labor laws. I mean, maybe they existed, but they weren't enforced, right? Like I said, I was doing this at 3 or 4. By the time I was 11, I was like an expert. In Immokalee and Lupe at the time, the water was from wells out near the fields. And we used to call it egg water because it stinks like rotten eggs, right? And that was the water that we had to drink. So, rather than drink that, if you're in a watermelon field, we just bust the watermelon and eat the heart out the watermelon. And the grower would always come along and be like, why did you just eat the heart out? You should eat the whole melon. I say, okay, sure. Right? Because the water was really awful. It had the sulfur water, egg water, it has a very high sulfur content. It smells horrible. Heat. I think there was a picture there on the graph where there are no trees in tomato fields, watermelon fields, cucumber fields. Don't know if you've been in Florida, April or May, but it is not pleasant. It is extremely hot. And it gets hot early and it stays hot all day. So, and again, out in the watermelon fields, the watermelons now, you go to the grocery store, they're round and they're small, and kind of like what I call bite-sized watermelons, right? They fit into your refrigerator. That's not what we picked. We picked giant striped Jubilee watermelons, the kind of watermelons that you get for a picnic. And if you've ever, I was trying to find a video of people picking watermelons, but it's 3 or 4 guys lined across, and you're this moving human conveyor belt where you bend down, you pick up the melon, you throw it to the guy next to you, and you catch the one coming from the guy next to you. You have to do it in rhythm. So it's down, pick it up, throw, catch, throw, and then the guy next to the truck has to catch the melon and throw it up. And then that guy has to stack. There's exactly 2 things that I'm really afraid of: thunder and lightning and the watermelon field. It is brutal. I don't care how big and strong you are. You do this for, I was a little guy, so I could do it for about 15 minutes before I was tired. A really big guy could make 45 minutes, maybe. But then the day hasn't even started. You got to do this all day in Florida heat. Now, let's tell you, this is, if you don't recognize, that's University of Florida. Okay, so I hate their football team. Kind of hate the whole university, but it's not just their football team, although that doesn't help. I really hate the stadium more than I hate the team. That's their stadium. It's named Ben Hill Griffin Stadium. I worked in Orange Groves owned by Ben Hill Griffin. I just hate that damn stadium. I mean, it's personal. The University of Florida basically is owned by the agricultural interests of the state. That's why it was set up. Florida A&M University was set up to help small African-American farmers who no longer exist. University of Florida was set up to help the large commercial growers. And so Ben Hill Griffin, who owned the orange groves, he operated out of a town called Frostproof. He owned the orange groves, he owned the housings, he owned the packing companies that where you take the fruit, he owned the juice company that where you take the fruit, he owned the trucks to get the fruit there. Yeah, he owned a lot of stuff. And apparently he owns the University of Florida. That's his granddaughter. If you may remember her from the 2000 election. Okay, perhaps. Right? This is his granddaughter. She was the Secretary of State. As you may remember, that was a disputed election. She helped steal the election from Mr. George W. Bush. So you can thank her for Bush. But to show you then, it's so she's the granddaughter of a large grower, but she's the daughter of a gentleman who owned a large bank in Lakeland. Lakeland is a city in Polk County. It's like a county above Highlands County where I grew up. The banking interests and the agricultural interests are the same people. Right? There's an interconnection there between who owns the bank and who owns the agriculture and who controls the university and who's now running state government in Florida. Right? Well, solutions. So the Fair Food Program, which Lupe mentioned, was one solution. It's an ingenious solution, right? Where you get around the growers, because the growers had really horrible to deal with, right? So you get around the growers by going directly to the restaurants or to the other end users of agricultural products. And one of the things I think that needs to be done is to incorporate the struggles and the victories of organizations like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers into economics textbooks. So if you ever had an econ class, principal economics, and you get to the point where they talk about how markets work, which has nothing to do with markets, but okay. They'll discuss price floors. And the example of a price floor is always a minimum wage. And the example in the textbook is that if you have a minimum wage, that's a wage above, a price floor is a minimum, a wage above the minimum, that the minimum wage will create unemployment. So you can't improve wages or working conditions for low-wage workers without creating unemployment. That's the takeaway point from standard economics textbook. The Fair Food Program shows that that's not true. Wages will increase dramatically for the average. I mean, a penny per pound more for a tomato translates into a large increase for a tomato picker. Right? Because you think about a hamburger at McDonald's or Burger King or somewhere, there's not a pound of tomatoes on that hamburger. It's like a slice. So it doesn't raise the cost of the product very much, right? Less than a penny. I think something like a quarter of a cent. But it's a penny per pound, the pound grown out in the field. That translates into a large increase for the pickers. Also, Lupe mentioned about the agreement reducing the number of sexual assaults. So the Fair Food Program also has elements that improves the working conditions. So here you had a program that improved both the working conditions and the pay by a much larger percentage than we ever see in a minimum wage increase. And it didn't generate any unemployment. So we should quit teaching the stuff that we teach in textbooks and teach something that's accurate. Right. Oh, okay. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Very much. So now we have an opportunity. Did you want to show that information, Nicole? So good. Now we can have a discussion. Thank you for your fantastic presentation. Thank you. Who would like to raise any points, comments, questions? All right. Yeah. Oh, and please say who you are. So we're gonna. We have to pass the mic around.
Hi. Thanks so much for these presentations. They were really informative. I'm sorry. I'm Jeanette Wickslim from the Political Economy Research Institute. I wanted to hear more about how you were able, this is for the CIW, the Lupe, how you were able to get buyers on board, just some more information or details about how you were able to do that.
Sí, pues en cada corporación siempre estamos viendo cómo es la compra que ellos hacen en los ranchos y pues decidimos si es una corporación que demanda grandes cantidades de tomate, nosotros podemos ir directamente con ellos para decirles pues esto es el acuerdo que queremos como organización, tenemos este programa, puedes unirte a este acuerdo y muchas veces pues en la mayoría de corporaciones que hemos tenido campaña para presionar a las corporaciones a venir a un acuerdo.
So first, we do a lot of analysis around the overall purchases and the types of food. So looking at who are the major buyers and the largest scale buyers, and particularly when we started of tomatoes in Florida, to know, is this someone that we can go to and say, look, this is the agreement that we would like. Here are the elements of that agreement, and this is a product that you purchase. But of course, for many of these companies, we've had to launch a full-blown campaign in order to actually bring them on board and have them sign an agreement with us. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that as Lupe's interpreter, and also have the pleasure of working with her at CIW, and came on board as one of the allies in that campaign over a decade ago. And so the CIW educates and mobilizes, especially young people, people of faith, conscious consumers across the country by first doing presentations and opening the eyes of many people who, as Lupe mentioned, don't always think about the sources of their food. Invite consumers to take a creative variety of actions, and it depends on the capacity, connections, and where a consumer fits in the landscape. So whether that could be, a letter writing campaign, publishing an op-ed, ranging from that to joining CIW for a tour across the country, a march, a fast in front of a particular corporate headquarters, in order to draw attention to the issue and to the calls for participation by the CIW. So one of the things that's especially remarkable about the CIW's work is that it has always remained very firmly worker-led. It's an organization that is fundamentally staffed by and driven by the worker community itself, but is very nimble and creative and innovative about mobilizing the power of consumers. And so inviting and building allyships across the country with different constituencies to bring them into the campaign and take action where it makes sense.
Hi, I'm Maggie Gray from Adelphi University. Thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about the relationships between the growers and the workers who are in the program. Because I know in both of your presentations, you've talked about a history of the impossibility of trying to work with the growers themselves. And Lupe, you mentioned that workers are at the trainings alongside supervisors. So I'm curious to know how the dynamics in the workplace have changed in terms of the relationship between workers and supervisors, and workers and the owners, if they have a relationship there.
Pues ahorita con el programa los trabajadores por lo menos ya conocemos a quiénes son los dueños de los ranchos, ¿no? Antes no sabíamos ni quiénes eran los dueños y nunca teníamos una comunicación. Ahora con el programa sí hay esa comunicación, ha cambiado bastante y es buena la dinámica, el hecho de que los mismos dueños de rancho, los mismos supervisores dicen que es un programa en el cual pues está previniendo que abusos o demandas hayan en sus ranchos, especialmente con lo de acoso sexual o el salario de los trabajadores. Ellos están previniendo que hayan grandes demandas y que ellos no van a perder.
Well, the first major change was that as workers, we even know the names of the growers of the farms who are working, especially on these migrant crews. You don't even necessarily know what farm you're being brought to work to. So that was one big change. So we now know what farms we're working on. And that dynamic has really improved over time, especially as growers see the value of the program itself. So because the program is fundamentally preventative, growers have seen that it has kept major lawsuits from their doorstep. It has been able to prevent cases of sexual harassment, of wage theft, of a lot of these abuses that otherwise might have blown up into a bigger legal problem actually for the farm. So that risk prevention is actually of benefit to those growers. And so that has improved the dynamic and seeing it as something that's all pulling in the same direction.
Y con los supervisores o los patrones también la dinámica ha cambiado bastante. Y claro que al principio del programa no estaban tan felices, ¿verdad? Porque los mismos estaban perdiendo ese poder que tenían de control en los trabajadores, que ellos podían hacer lo que querían y no iba a haber ninguna consecuencia, no iba a pasarles nada. Pero ahora pues ya ellos lo están viendo de una manera diferente, de que son protecciones de derechos humanos. Entonces, básicamente este programa se trata de ganar y ganar, porque como trabajadores tenemos protecciones de derechos humanos, los rancheros no tienen grandes demandas por tener trabajadores en situaciones de abuso y las grandes corporaciones pueden ofrecer a su consumidor pues productos que vienen cosechados con dignidad, productos que los trabajadores están siendo protegidos como seres humanos.
And then with regards to the education session and some of the supervisors, of course, naturally at the beginning of the Fair Food Program, many of the supervisors were not all that happy about it being implemented because it was a real change in the power dynamic on the farm. They were losing that complete control and power over the workplace and being able to take whatever actions they wanted, treat workers however they wanted, and knew before that they would face no consequences. And now with the Fair Food Program, they saw a real change in that power dynamic. But over the years, they've grown more accustomed to that and have come to see and understand the program as something that is about fundamental human rights. And so overall, what we've seen in the program is that it's able to offer a win-win-win situation at the end of the day, even for the industry. So obviously for workers, our rights are protected. For the growers, they're able to avoid these, sometimes potentially large lawsuits, bad press, a lot of the things that come with these days with those types of abuses being exposed in a particular supply chain. And then, of course, for the large corporations at the top of the supply chain as well, it's the same deal. They're able to get a product that they know is produced in an environment of human rights in which the women and men who are harvesting those products are, in fact, protected.
Well, in terms of the relationship between the workers and the growers, it's kind of a funny relationship, right? The towns in South Florida, South Central Florida, they're all heavily segregated racially, right? So Sebring, where I grew up, a little small town, but I knew everybody in town. So I knew who the growers were because after schools were desegregated, in 1970, I went to school with the children of the growers. All right, so I knew the growers, and the growers were well known anyway. I mean, at that time, it was a lot of family-owned farms, and then later Kraft and Coca-Cola began to come in and more larger multinationals. The other element in this process, too, are labor contractors. So there's like two different ways that companies will organize the labor force. Some companies had their own foreman who would go out and, get workers. Other growers use contractors. So if you had African-American workers, the contractors were African-American. In fact, the contractors lived in the contractors were like my neighbors, literally. Right? So, and the contractors were like ruthless capitalists, right? They didn't care. I mean, the law. They didn't care about the law. The law is whatever I do. So there was a lot of wage theft involved in their activities. There's a lot of forced labor. So at the same time, they were like among the most high-income people in the neighborhood. So the relationship, if you will, between the growers, between the workers and the growers, yeah, I knew who they were, but that didn't make me enamored of them, right? I also knew what they were doing, right? And so you understood the exploitation. And, I don't think that part changed.
question on the wall.
Diego asks, what strategies did you use to bring the fast food restaurants to the table?
Sí, pues hicimos acciones, hicimos marcha, muchas veces, bueno, cada año cuando había junta de accionistas también fuimos hasta las sedes centrales de las corporaciones de comida rápida y como se mencionó anteriormente, los consumidores también pues han tenido una participación bastante importante en esta lucha porque han estado con nosotros y eso ha movido a las corporaciones a firmar estos acuerdos.
So in addition to the marches and rallies and types of actions that we do, we also, every time that there was a publicly owned company that would have a shareholder meeting, we would often also go to the headquarters of the company to have a protest outside and sometimes inside as well. And as was previously mentioned, we've mobilized a great deal of consumers, and it's really that consumer power and that consumer voice that has ultimately brought companies to the table.
So I'm Seema from India, and thank you very much for those excellent presentations. My question was actually, there are two questions. One is where you mention sexual harassment and exploitation. I just wanted to understand whether it was also co-workers apart from the growers and supervisors, and how did you deal with that? And my second question is actually really more about how do you sustain the movement? Because I think it's really more than 2 decades or more than that. How do you really sustain and constantly engage workers in action, both in terms of how do you sort of work on the agenda, but also in terms of financial resources?
Pues sí hay acoso entre mismos compañeros de trabajo, no solamente es el supervisor o el contratista, sino que ese es un círculo, ¿verdad?, que se enfrenta los trabajadores.
So first, there is certainly instances of sexual harassment between workers, as well as from a supervisor or grower. That's unfortunately kind of part of the cycle.
Y pues cuando hacemos, por ejemplo, giras o cuando hacemos acciones, pues los trabajadores no pagan, por ejemplo, cuando el bus, si vamos en un bus, no pagan por la comida, entonces eso pues es un costo que lo cubre la organización vive por medio de donaciones. Entonces, sí, los trabajadores dejamos a veces de trabajar 15 días, pero sabemos que lo que estamos haciendo es algo que realmente cambia la vida de un trabajador. Por ejemplo, cuando yo dejaba de trabajar, yo sabía que esta lucha que yo estoy haciendo es beneficio no solamente para mí, sino para todos los trabajadores. Entonces, es algo que sí tiene su compensación y es la protección de ser tratados como seres humanos y no de que nos vean como máquina de producción.
And with regards to sustaining action, and in particular for the worker community, we as an organization cover a lot of the costs involved in some of the actions. So making sure that there is, to leave work for 15 days is obviously a huge sacrifice for a lot of workers, but we make sure that, of course, they're not paying for the bus or food or anything like that in participating in our actions. But also, fundamentally, it's about building a vision and a movement that's about changing our own lives and fighting for dignity. When I would leave work for 15 days, I knew that I was going on a tour or to an action that was not only going to bring new protections and rights for me as an individual, but for all of the workers in my community, and that that was really what made those actions worth it, and what drives a lot of workers is knowing that at the end of the day we can build a work environment in which we're treated like human beings instead of like machines.
Hi, I'm Orithro. I am a graduate student in the econ department here. So I was wondering how you navigate through. So are these workers like from similar ethnic groups, similar nationalities? If not, like there exists the possibility that different groups could be pitted against one another. So how do you build solidarity in that process, and how does that happen? Are the supervisors and the workers people generally from the same nationality or otherwise, and so on? So what does really happen at the ground level, and how do you combat the differences in identities that could be pitted against solidarity? Thank you.
Sí, pues sí, somos de diferentes países. En Immokalee, gente de Guatemala, de México, de Haití. Y sí, antes del programa de comida justa, pues los mismos contratistas hacían esa división, ¿verdad? Para que no se pudiera tener comunicación. Pero con el programa de comida justa, al quitar ese poder a los contratistas, ya no podían hacer esa división con los trabajadores. Y los trabajadores tienen una sola voz, independientemente del país o independientemente del idioma que habla el trabajador, tienen las mismas protecciones de los derechos y pueden reportar. Cuando un trabajador tiene una voz para reportar, pues ya no va a tener el poder ese contratista de hacer esa diferencia o de dividir a los trabajadores.
So we are from a number of different communities in the area of Immokalee, for example, workers from Mexico, Guatemala, and Haiti. And certainly prior to the Fair Food Program and in the early days of the CIW, there was a huge effort among supervisors in particular to pit different communities against each other and to make sure that workers weren't connecting with each other. But especially with the introduction of the Fair Food Program, it was built to ensure the rights of any worker in the fields regardless of where they're from. So making sure that all workers in the context of this of the program are able to speak up and to report any abuse that happens regardless of the language they speak, regardless of their background. And so that created a broader kind of power among workers through the program, in the Fair Food Program, and shifted that balance with the supervisors. De educación popular también.
Sí, se hace educación popular cuando vamos a los ranchos, usamos dibujos. Tenemos varios dibujos en el que se reflexiona junto con el trabajador sobre las situaciones y cómo el trabajador puede hacer para que no hayan problemas.
And another strategy that we've used throughout the CIW's work and continue to use in worker-to-worker education is popular education. So bringing visuals into a lot of our educational efforts in order to not depend solely on language, but for visuals to be used as a basis for reflection to draw out some of that analysis that, again, is accessible across language barriers.
We have another question online. Alicia asks, I know you may not know the answer to this question yet, but from your work so far on the international expansions, can you talk a bit about what are some of the main similarities and what are some of the most surprising differences between the situation for low-wage workers in Chile and South Africa?
Todavía estamos en ese proceso porque pues es un programa piloto que apenas empezó y pues todavía hace falta mucho estudio para ver qué son esas diferencias, pero ya creo que vamos a tener una mejor respuesta ya más adelante.
So this the pilot program internationally is just began. And so we're very much still in the process of implementing and learning and connecting with groups on the ground. And so, the honest answer is that we're still are learning about what those differences are and those challenges are. And so stay tuned.
Thank you for the presentation. It's very inspiring. I'm Wen Juan from Verite. It's a local NGO in town. And I have two questions. The first is, what are the most challenging aspects in organizing workers? Because we know it's hard to organize workers, especially in the agriculture sector. And the second question is, how do you monitoring the Fair Food program now? Because I remember Verite used to monitor that program in the early days. Thank you.
Pues es difícil cuando un trabajador pues tiene miedo primero, porque se preocupa de perder el trabajo quizás por organizar, pero otras cosas que a veces también pasa es político. Entonces hay mucho que el trabajador le tiene que pensar para pues hacer algo de movilizarse o organizar. Entonces, pero nosotros en Immokalee, en la comunidad, hacemos juntas comunitarias. Cada miércoles hacemos junta de mujeres cada domingo para animar al trabajador a organizarse, porque es la única manera de traer cambios, de traer protecciones en el lugar de trabajo. Y con todo esto que hemos logrado con el programa, con todas las giras y acciones, pues el mismo trabajador se da cuenta de que no debe de tener miedo, ¿verdad? Entonces eso es algo que ha cambiado bastante y eso es algo que en la comunidad de Immokalee pues hemos invertido bastante tiempo para que el trabajador se anime a seguir luchando.
So, of course, the greatest challenge to organizing workers is fear, and fear of many different things. And that's very present in our community. And not only of, fear of the effects on your job, but there's also the political environment. And so that can instill a sense of fear in workers and a desire to keep your head down. But what we've seen in Immokalee and what we've been able to build through doing Wednesday night community meetings, which we do every single week during this season. We have a women's group that meets every single Sunday. We've been able to build that consciousness around the importance of organizing is really the only way that we will be able to ultimately get to a solution where we can bring that kind of change and seeing that is really the singular path that we see. And then the other thing is over the years, especially as the CIW has launched and run these large-scale campaigns and traveled across the country and won. And so there's a real sense of consciousness in our community and people are able to see that I don't need to be afraid. I'm seeing all of these people lift up their voices and win these campaigns, and that has been able to build a sense of safety for workers. Y la segunda pregunta es cómo monitorean ahora el programa, porque en nuestra ella trabaja con
Pues como mencioné un poco cuando estaba haciendo la presentación, se creó el Consejo por Comida Justa, que es una organización independiente. Entonces ellos son los que hacen auditorías, ellos también van a los ranchos, pero están acá los del consejo y mañana ellos van a entrar más a fondo cómo es que hacen su trabajo, pero pues cuando teníamos el programa teníamos que crear algo que enforzara y que asegurara que esos derechos se iban a estar cumpliendo en los ranchos.
And then with regards to monitoring, as I mentioned in the first couple of years of the program, the CIW recognized the need to create a full independent body that was just dedicated to monitoring the program, and so created the Fair Food Standards Council, which is a third-party body. We have some of them in the room tonight. And they're going to be speaking at length tomorrow a bit more about what that monitoring looks like in depth. But they do the auditing and the complaint resolution process and have since some of the earliest real full seasons of the program.
We weren't successful.
Okay, so Fernando Lozano from Pomona College. Lupe, gracias por compartir tu historia con nosotros. Marley, thank you for translating. And Patrick, I know you for 23 years, and I always thought you cheered for University of Florida. I just learned more from you in these 30 minutes than in 23 years. Thank you for that. My question is, how can we help? ¿Cómo podemos ayudar?
Mucho que se puede hacer. Como mencioné, seguimos en campaña. Ahorita tenemos la campaña con Kroger y tenemos un boicot con Wendy's. Entonces, la manera en que se puede hacer es hacer delegaciones a las tiendas de Kroger o Wendy's, hablar sobre el programa, cómo es que hemos logrado traer cambios.
So there's many different ways for people to be able to continue to be involved and to help. The CIW has active campaigns, as I mentioned, first with Kroger, and also we have a national boycott against Wendy's. And so both of those companies, we still have active campaigns with them to bring them into the Fair Food Program. So, if one lives near them, you can always deliver a manager letter. Also add that we have, and this is breaking news, we have a week of action coming up that has not even been announced yet. So you're the first to hear it, but during Thanksgiving week and the week leading up, we'll be asking people to focus on doing letter deliveries, in particular with Kroger, which was the company connected to one of the recent forced labor cases by the Department of Labor, who actually said, these watermelons, and ended up from being harvested by people who are being held in forced labor and ended up on in the produce aisles of Kroger, is one of course the largest and about to get a lot larger supermarkets in the country. And so especially in the time of Thanksgiving, when many people of course are going to supermarkets and thinking about food and thinking about family, we are asking people to take action. But if you subscribe on our website, you'll get updates about exactly how to do that. And we also have the Sustainer program. So we are, one of the other main ways that, of course, everyone can pitch in a little is instead of buying a couple of lattes at Starbucks, signing up to be a sustainer of, $5 or $10 a month. It's become a huge program and a really, really important source of truly flexible and critical funding for the Fair Food Program and the growth of workers. As anyone knows who works in NGOs and in academia, funding is very challenging, and one of the integral parts of the CIW is its independent funding. So of course, instead of coming from corporations or other sources like that, we rely on a number of other sources, including small dollar donations from everyday consumers who are a part of this movement.
Jeanette. Oh. Do the online and then do that. And
Linda asks, going back to the very early days of your movement, can you say a little bit about how you began to build the movement and build solidarity among the workers? What kind of advice would you give for other workers trying to build movements like yours?
Pues creo que el hecho de hacer educación popular en la comunidad también fue algo que hizo que los trabajadores pudieran estar conscientes y que los mismos trabajadores experimentaban estos abusos y cómo los trabajadores tenían una visión de cambiar el mundo de la industria, cómo ellos querían ser tratados como seres humanos. Entonces eso es algo que se tiene que buscar, ¿no? Porque si uno como trabajador no lucha, si uno como trabajador solo se queda callado, pues nada va a cambiar. Entonces es importante que los mismos trabajadores se concienticen entre ellos mismos para poder traer estos cambios. Y como dije, pues el modelo del programa es algo que puede ayudar ahora a otros grupos a que estas soluciones lleguen hasta su lugar de trabajo.
And so some of those really important and fundamental elements of using popular education, which is again a very visual medium, workers themselves leading the process and having had the experience themselves of those abuses in the fields and of that exploitation, building that analysis together with other workers, again, through those types of methods is really important in terms of coming to a type of solution and everyone coming together, because it has to be workers leading that process and having a voice in that process and thinking together about how to build a solution for their particular industry. So having that worker-led piece and having workers get together to build that is really critical. And again, using tools like popular education can help with that. And now, of course, the WSR model is offering a new type of tool for workers all over in many different industries as a type of tool that they can start to organize towards.
My name is Jeanette Wixlam again from PERI. My two questions. One was to Lupe about whether or how your political campaigns have changed over the years. Have you had to find new, different strategies, and have you incorporated legislative strategies, trying to change labor laws alongside campaigning to get buyers to change their behavior? And then my second question is for Patrick. You've said a lot about what you despise about what's being taught in principles classes, economics classes, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what you'd rather have students learn about how the labor market operates. So the first question was this, how have maybe political strategies changed over time?
Pues con las campañas sí, tal vez algunas experiencias la hemos traído al presente, pues siempre hemos tratado de adaptarlo para hacer más que el consumidor se involucre más, ¿verdad? Entonces eso sí es algo que con cada campaña es diferente, pero siempre es un camino que sabemos que llega o tiene que llegar a hacer un acuerdo. Y en cuanto a cambiar las leyes, no nos hemos enfocado tanto en eso porque, pues, al principio quizás era algo que se estaba pensando, pero realmente las leyes cambian siempre. Con las administraciones que están entrando, están cambiando, y si es algo que tal vez pasa una resolución, pero después llega alguien más, lo quita, entonces el trabajador no puede nada más estar esperando que algo de las leyes venga y después se va. Con el programa de comida justa es algo que está siempre presente. Cada temporada se hacen las sesiones de educación. Los trabajadores, no importa quién está en la administración, tanto del Estado como del país, siempre tienen las protecciones. Entonces eso es algo que queremos quedarnos con eso porque sabemos que es algo que funciona.
So with the campaign over the years, it's of course evolved over time, trying to find new, depending on the company, but also always trying to find new strategies to keep consumers very engaged. I'll add two examples of that. One is more digital strategies, of course, over time as the internet has evolved. Of course, we've been on the internet since its early days. Again, our domain is ciw-online.org, which is, right, it's a very cool name, but just in case you didn't know, it was a website that was online. And then, and so we've been involved in the digital world for a long time, but continue to remain on the cutting edge of that. And then also, of course, evolving our shareholder campaigns to engage with capital a bit more. And so the campaign has evolved over time. And then with regards to, this is going back to translation, but with regards to legislative campaigns, frankly, no. We have not taken that strategy. Maybe it was something that was considered in the early days, but realistically, what we've seen as workers is that even if you can get a law passed, it changes. Everything is always dependent on the pendulum swinging in terms of politics and who's in administration, whether it's at a state level or a federal level. And so as workers, you might see a huge win and then see it completely rolled back with a new administration. Whereas with the Fair Food Program, it's something that is there and it's constant. And every season, there's an education session, and the program is evergreen, and it continues regardless of who is in Tallahassee in the governor's mansion and who is in the White House. And so that's really been not something that we've pursued, and I would add, especially not recently.
So the question was, what should we teach in economics if the stuff that we're teaching in the traditional textbooks is not very good or not useful? Well, I think you have to start with teaching the reality of exploitation, right? Which that word is almost banned in most economics textbooks. And we have to teach, what is exploitation? How does it work? The thing that really attracted me to economics was I was reading, dare I say it, Karl Marx, and he provided an explanation of exploitation, and it just like, yes, this explains picking oranges. Right? So it was very simple. So the other textbooks did not explain what happened in the orange groves. Karl Marx got it, and he even used an example of piece rate earnings and how piece rate work, translating into an hourly wage, and what exploitation is all about. And we have to teach that. And along with exploitation, another word that's banned in textbooks is redistribution, right? At one point, seems like, well, it was decades ago now, I guess it was in the 70s, and I remember the textbook said that redistribution was one of the purposes of government. I don't think any textbook has said that since disco. You don't talk, and it's always redistribution of income and never redistribution of wealth. And you have to make this discussion, you have to deal with the issue of redistribution of wealth. There is, the redistribution and the persistent racism are things that are connected to each other. Right, and draw a connection between that and the segregated nature of society we live in. So in agricultural work, the work itself is segregated between who does the work, who owns the orange groves. They're not the same people. Who owns the banks that also, like the house that we lived in was owned by a bank that was owned by growers. So, like one time my father went to work and he was really proud. He made a lot of money that week. Boy, he worked real hard. And he got the check and it was like nothing there. Because the grower had decided, well, we're gonna take out the mortgage payment now. And, it was kind of behind, so he took out everything. You didn't get a choice. Right, because there's interconnections between those groups, because the wealth is also concentrated, and the concentrated wealth also leads to all kind of issues in political domain. So we have to teach distribution. We have to teach, in particular, what was this? I think I saw on the news the other day where a person got upset because a Democrat mentioned placing a tax on wealth. And of course, a very wealthy person was angry and said, you can't tax wealth, it'll just destroy the country. Well, middle class people get taxed on wealth all the time. It's called a property tax. You got one basic asset, a house, and it's taxed on a very regular basis. So why can't you tax financial wealth and other forms of wealth? So we have to have textbooks that really delve into these kinds of issues that affect people, the lives of everyday people, and then go from those issues to the technical stuff that economists are fond of. That's actually what Adam Smith did. It's what Karl Marx did. It's what classical economists did. They all looked at real problems that were affecting people, and then they analyzed those problems, came up with solutions, and developed the technical apparatus around them. We have to stop teaching people this stuff called perfect competition. That is like a really stupid thing to teach somebody, right? Because it means the absence of competition. It's like you have competition when nobody cares what anybody else is doing. That ain't competition. In competition, everybody's concerned with what other people are doing, and hopefully you can crush them, right? Or you can find a way to get around the things that they're doing to you, right? So we have to change that. We have to talk about power, which is another thing that's missing from traditional textbooks. And there's a relationship, too, between international trade and what happens with workers and international capital movements. So to give you an example, because one of the things that happens a lot of times with immigration, in a country full of immigrants, people are often hostile to immigrants. It's like, I'm in, you can't come, right? Thinking that somehow or another immigrants hurt the wages and working conditions of domestic workers. Well, capital doesn't need the workers to come to the job. You can move the job to the workers. That's even true in agriculture. So in the 80s, Florida had 3 really bad freezes, and it affected the orange growers. So at one point, they considered trying to buy a huge chunk of Belize. Yeah. If you got enough money to buy Belize, you should be taxed. You got enough money to redistribute. So they tried to buy, and why did they want to buy a huge chunk of Belize and lease it back to people in Belize? Because they were going to move the orange groves to Belize and ship the oranges back here. So when you buy like orange juice, you know, you don't know if the oranges came from Florida or wherever, right? The juice is juice. It's just juice inside of a carton. And most people, and it's bad tasting juice, by the way, but it's another thing, because it's not fresh. But so we never draw those connections between capital movements, labor movements, and a more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between immigration and well-being of domestic workers, right? So yeah, there are a lot of things I would like to change, but.
Okay, well, that is a great place to stop and to start the next phase of the conference. First of all, again, thank you so much, Lupe, Patrick, Marley. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all online. And we will start again tomorrow morning, the breakfast. 8:30, breakfast downstairs. The conference program, the first one is at 9:30. Okay, and for those of you coming to dinner, it's at your van right outside, down in the parking lot. Also, you go a block or so, there you are. Anyway, again, thank you all for being here. Look forward to